ethnic studies has become very controversial. In California, AB 1460 was passed, and with that, a model curriculum for how ethnic studies should be taught in California classrooms and then eventually rolled out on a national level. Now, this is a very polarized issue, as some people are calling the ethnic studies model curriculum and elements of it that include concepts like critical race theory. People are labeling it as anti-American, as dangerous, as divisive, as regressive. And then others are hailing it as important and necessary and long overdue and generally positive. So if we aren't willing to have a conversation with one another and try and learn from one another, we are at an impasse. I was truly thrilled to bring Dr. Christine Sleeter onto my podcast because I read through the model curriculum and I was unsure of a lot of her points. She was a major contributor to the ideologies behind this model curriculum. And I went into this conversation the way that I implore you to go into it. I went in with an open mind and a willingness to hear her, see her the way she wishes to be seen, and truly look to learn from her wisdom and experience. We must be willing to learn from those we disagree with. And every time I have someone on this podcast that I'm not sure where they're coming from, it always gets cleared up by the end. So if you have concerns about the ethnic studies model curriculum, please listen to this conversation and use it as a jumping off point to start more conversations with people you agree with and disagree with, so we can all find compromise and common ground to move forward with something truly wonderful in our school system. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles that started this podcast to try and break echo chambers. I think that there is a problem in society where we aren't talking to one another enough. And one of the topics that I think falls into this echo chamber category is ethnic studies in school. And I think that ethnic studies is extremely important and important to get right in education. And I have taught in so many diverse environments in my career that I have seen the importance of celebrating all of our differences and cultures and understanding them for what they really are. And it's so important that we get ethnic studies right. So my guest today is Dr. Christine Sleeter. She is a retired professor and educational activist at Cal State Monterey Bay, and she is one of the top leaders in ethnic studies and the ethnic studies model curriculum going out in California. And with so much going on today and to talk about critical race theory and racial issues and things like that, I wanted to reach out to Dr. Sleeter just to try and clear up whatever questions people might have regarding this stuff. So I went right to the source, to one of the top experts, and I'm thrilled to have her here. Dr. Sleeter, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your background. What got you into ethnic studies as one of your focus points for education?
Okay. I grew up in Southern Oregon, and my education growing up was all white, both K-12 level and university level. After I graduated from the university and was trying to figure out what to do with myself, I signed up for a teacher preparation program that was designed to prepare teachers for urban schools. And I think the main reason I signed up for it, this isn't a great reason, it's that it was located in Seattle. And at the time I was living in Ellensburg, Washington. And Seattle seemed like a much more interesting place to live. So there you go.
Yeah.
I was assigned to a very racially and ethnically diverse working class high school, Cleveland High School, for the 8 months of the program. And during that time, I had to grapple with and confront the huge chasm between my growing up experience and where the kids were coming from. And this was also in the early 1970s. So it was coming on the heels of the civil rights movement and the ethnic revival movement and the beginnings of ethnic studies at the university level. And so I would hear people make references to things that, now you'd think, of course you'd be aware of that, but at the time I wasn't, like who is Malcolm X and what's this autobiography of Malcolm X? So during that experience, I started reading what turned out to be ethnic studies literature, just by way of trying to fill in some of the gaps that were all over the place in my own understanding. There were also other things that I did to try to get to know the kids in the context. I spent quite a bit of time just talking informally with the kids and listening to them, really more than talking to them. And over the time I was teaching in Seattle, which was several years then after that, living in Black-white neighborhood and getting to know people in the community. And so the reading wasn't the only thing I was doing, but it turned out to be a very useful thing. So at first, when I was reading ethnic studies books, I was just kind of grabbing whatever I could find. And then as a classroom teacher, I became a little bit more systematic in that I thought, okay, this year I'm going to focus on African-American history and literature. And so I would find books and then read them. Okay, this next year, I'm going to focus on Chicano history and literature. And so then the following year, okay, I'm going to focus on Native American history and literature. And so this, by the time I went off to graduate school, where I started kind of zeroing in on multicultural education, which became the work that I've done for about 40 years. I was developing this knowledge base that came directly out of ethnic studies. And the time I spent in Seattle, and particularly the time spent with African-American friends and colleagues, just in addition to the reading I was doing and the school experiences and participating in workshops and stuff, changed me enough that I couldn't go back to Medford, Oregon, where I'd grown up. I mean, physically I could go there, but psychologically I wasn't there anymore. And so that got me into this learning trajectory.
That I relate to that so much. I was raised in a community in Eastern Pennsylvania that was pretty white. Had a decent Puerto Rican population, but it was mostly white. And my student teaching was outside of Philadelphia, and it was a school that was about 75% Black. And I remember at one point, these two kids came in, these two Black kids came in, they go, Mr. Roosh, settle the bet. Which one's more ashy, me or, and I was like, are you out of your minds? I am not answering that question with a 30-foot pole. Get out of here. No way am I touching that. But you mentioned, it's just like being exposed to this stuff, like that it's not even your fault. You just don't know. You mentioned about living in that community. One of my favorite quotes, and I bring it up in this podcast all the time, is a Pope Francis quote, "A good shepherd smells like sheep." And I love that. I love the idea that you can't help people that you don't really understand, that you don't spend enough time around them to really get what they want, what they need, what makes them tick. Like, you have to immerse yourself in these cultures. So the fact that you lived in the environment where you taught, I think is really important for getting to a lot of the ideas around these ethnic studies, concepts, is really knowing the community in which you're serving.
An event that was in some ways symbolic of exactly that. At one point during one of the years I was teaching, I was a learning disabilities teacher at Roosevelt High School in Seattle. And Roosevelt was one of the predominantly white schools that was being desegregated. And I was living in a neighborhood from which some of the Black kids were being bused into Roosevelt. So the buses went on strike for a couple of weeks. Labor dispute issue. And so the kids were having to figure out how to get back and forth. And so I ended up taking some of the kids in my neighborhood up to the school where I was teaching. But it was going from the space where the African-American kids were coming, both physically as well as psychologically, into this desegregated sort of white space. And that was interesting. That was...
Yeah. Yeah, because even though it's not formal segregation, we are still segregated. I mean, look at statistics on how segregated schools are right now. I mean, it's still pretty shocking. It's more than I think people would think. So getting into addressing this, when you talk about you started focusing on this as early as the 1970s, I mean, it was a different time. There were real like law barriers preventing people, marginalized communities, Black and brown people, from doing certain things and things like that. I wonder if there has been an overcorrection. I don't know if there has, but has there been an overcorrection in the modern day? Just in terms of concepts like critical race theory and things like that. There are elements of that are very controversial. And I wonder, I heard you say that you think critical race theory is a part of like a good direction, is like a compass to kind of guide ethnic studies. Would that be accurate?
I don't necessarily think of that way.
Okay.
They've come about in the same spaces, but in different historical contexts.
Yeah, very different. Yeah.
But critical race theory, the way I understand it, and I've read quite a bit and done some writing around critical race theory, so I understand it pretty well, is a theoretical tool or a theoretical set of tools for helping you dig into how race works. It simply really asks the question, not is race at work in this situation, but rather how is race at work? And so it allows you to go deeper by, instead of spending all your energy trying to like, is there racism here or not? As people of color will experience, whether it be a school or a bank or whatever, there is racism going on. And to debate whether or not that's the case is just, spending a lot of extra energy. Your energy more goes into trying to understand and unpack how is racism at work.
Yeah.
And that's a very useful tool.
Yeah. So here's where I get kind of like confused, because I've read a lot of critical race theory. I kind of keep a log of all the different work. It's like I've read Barbara Applebaum and Richard Delgado and Mark Bray, Peggy McIntosh, obviously, Allison Bailey, Miranda Fricker, Alexis Shotwell, like all these different people, Dereck Bell, Kimberle Crenshaw. But then I've also read like kind of like opposing views from Thomas Sowell and Thomas Chatterton Williams and Camille Foster and Chloe Valdery and Irshad Manji. And I see that they're kind of going back and forth. So my question is, what would you say? And you might not know, I mean, just curiosity, like what do you think that the critical race theorists see that even like well-respected Black intellectuals like Thomas Sowell, who's a professor at Stanford, or Glenn Lowry, who's a professor at Brown, like they're fighting against critical race theory. Aisha Akambi, Black woman from the UK, Chloe Valdery, these are Black intellectuals, very well educated, that are fighting against critical race theory. And I wonder, what are they missing? I know you don't know because you don't know them in particular, but like I wonder what these respected Black intellectuals that are speaking against critical race theory are missing that so many critical race theorists tend to see. And I brought Rod Graham on my podcast, and he isn't a critical race theory professor, but he represents them pretty well. And we went into this a little bit, but he wasn't quite sure. I'm curious what your thoughts are about why is it that I've seen so many well-respected Black intellectuals are fighting back against this. They think that it's like, whatever. I've heard their arguments that it's like, it's divisive, or it's like pseudo-intellectual, all that kind of stuff. Like Coleman Hughes went after Ibram Kendi and said, let's have a talk about this. And Ibram Kendi didn't want to. Are you aware of those individuals, the Black intellectuals who are?
I'm aware of some people's critiques of ethnic study.
Yeah.
One who's a good friend who, it's like a friendly critique, but it's a critique, is Zeus Leonardo at UC Berkeley. And here's how I understand it, because I can also critique critical race theory. I haven't in my writings, but I can. Every theoretical perspective enables you to see some things more clearly And it also occludes some other things. That's true of every theoretical perspective. And critical race theory is no exception. It helps you dig into how race works, and there are other things that it's not really looking at. And one of the big things that like Zeus has written about, and I see this, I just haven't taken on critical race theory because I don't know what the point would be. But it doesn't really look at class, and it doesn't really look at how race and class work together, which actually I think is a really important question to look at. And that's not what critical race theory does. So when I use critical race theory, I'll use it for the tools that it has for uncovering some things. I think like the tool of, now I'm blocking on but the point is, it has some useful conceptual analytical tools, and I'll use those. But if you want to look at how do race and class work together, how does capitalism develop out of race, or race develop out of capitalism? Yeah. Critical race theory will only get you so far.
Right. That's a great analysis, Doctor. Thank you. That's a great point, because I have my issues with like postmodernists. So like, you know, the Lyotard, Foucault, Derrida. And I talked to someone who is like, look, it's not meant to be like the way to see the world. It's a way to see the world and think and trigger those kinds of things. And maybe that's getting to something that is really important, is critical race theory. Like you said, it's one way to address this that maybe you'll highlight. And if it opens up certain parts of your brain, if you're willing to be open-minded and take it in, it's not the end all be all, but it's a perspective that's valid, and hear it out, and then you put that up against, yeah, what about Black immigrants, and what about, you know, the class thing, what about the arguments of Thomas Sowell? So let's read Ibram Kendi and Thomas Sowell. You know, like, let's get all of these different perspectives, because it's not like Thomas Sowell is 100% right. It's not like Ta-Nehisi Coates is exactly right. Like, they all have different experiences, and if we are willing to do that, we might get somewhere.
Yeah, and there's another thing that's happened with critical race theory that happens with any theory, I think, that comes in, and a lot of people get excited about it. And that is that I've seen it in various pieces of writing, sometimes articles I get sent to review and stuff, not used well. People will announce, I'm writing from the perspective of critical race theory because it's a study having to do with race, and we'll give some of the history of critical race theory and stuff, but then never really use it. And I see that happen, especially with novice scholars who are just learning some of the theoretical frameworks, and instead of using it as a tool, kind of put it as a badge. And critical race theory isn't the only theory that gets used poorly that way, but that probably is one of the things that contributes to people thinking that it's not very solid.
Right. Yeah. And you have to really dig in. You know, you really have to like actually read the books and again, go into it with an open mind. I talked to someone who was more like very like left leaning, and they said, oh, I watch Fox News. And I said, well, do you watch Fox News with an open mind? Do you actually like watch it to try and learn something, or are you just going in just critical to show how idiotic they are? Because if you're trying to go into a conversation like, you have nothing you can teach me, you are a fool, well, then you're going to find that. But if you go into it with an open mind, just like if you lose a contact lens on the floor, if you're looking for a contact lens, you'll find it. But if you're not looking for it, you're not going to find it. And I think that that's something that I would like to call out to my friends who are on whether it's center, liberal, or even on the right, who are critiquing critical race theory, which I have as well, to just open your mind up a little bit. Look, there is value there if you are willing to be open-minded about it, and you don't have to agree with everything, but it's important to take it with a positive approach. I think that's really, really important. Do you think that that ethnic studies is predominantly a left-leaning, like the politicization, I always struggle with that word, of education? Is it like is it a left-leaning viewpoint by your analysis?
Well, let me say, just talk a little bit about how I understand ethnic studies.
Please, please.
And again, I'm going to put it in a historic context, like I put myself in a historic context. That it arose on university campuses during the late 1960s, when students of color who wanted an education that was relevant to their lives. And the curriculum in higher ed was all white. The faculty were pretty much all white. There was no relationship in most universities between what was being studied in the university and the real life problems that communities of color were experiencing, where having some knowledgeable people would help, but the knowledge that was delivered in the universities just didn't have any relationship. And so what students were asking for is, one, well, to be admitted into the university, for more students of color to be admitted. Two, to have a curriculum that was relevant to who they were and their histories, their backgrounds, their communities, and to be taught by people who are from their communities and understand this stuff. Now, fast forward to 50 years later, where are we? Well, if you go and analyze the traditional curriculum at the K-12 level, even though it has diverse people in it, it's still a predominantly white curriculum. And I know that because I've analyzed textbook, I've analyzed state standards. It's not that complicated to analyze curriculum and go through and count the people, the references to people and stuff. Students of color are aware of that. Interviews with students of color that have been published, as well as just informal conversations that you might have with students. The older they get, the more they go through the system, the more they still see a gap between what the school is teaching them and the knowledge from their elders in their homes and communities, who will give them counter stories about who we are, where we've been, what our trajectory is, what the problems we're working on are. And again, it's the students are asking for something that's relevant to them, their communities, their backgrounds. And so during those 50 years, a whole lot of academic work got written. And this is where, the books that I started picking up reading, that I would call the ethnic studies literature, started filling in the history, the literature, the philosophy, the arts, in some cases the science. There's work being done in math. So it's kind of across the disciplines of knowledge from viewpoints that are not grounded in Euro-American viewpoints.
Yeah.
And that's how I understand ethnic studies.
Yeah, I heard you say one time in an interview or something, like it made a lot of students feel like they were a guest in their own home, or a guest in someone else's home.
Someone else's home. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's, so if you look through the history books, you don't see a lot of people who look like you. I was teaching in a 0% white school. It was mostly Hispanic. It was about 80% Hispanic, and there was a lot about African American history. A lot. So there's a lot on slavery. There was a lot on, Civil War and Reconstruction and segregation and civil rights. And they kept saying, like, where's the Mexicans, Mr. Rich? Where's the El Salvadorian kid? Where's the Hispanic kids or people? And I was like, that's a great point. Yeah. I mean, and especially if we're talking about in California, that has such a large Hispanic population. When you say like seeing themselves in curriculum, one of my favorite musicals is Hamilton. And one of the things that Hamilton was able to pull off, so what makes me believe it's possible, is taking these white guys and basically using their ideas. It was still representing Thomas Jefferson's ideas, but in the way that they did it through casting and writing is it gave ownership to all Americans, regardless of color and background and culture and stuff like that. And I thought that was inspiring for me, because I was like, wow, like Lin-Manuel Miranda can do that. We can do that. We can connect these, old white guys in our textbooks to modern things. And, Frederick Douglass was very, supportive of the Constitution, even though he was very critical of America and the way they've applied the Constitution. He said the Constitution is going to be our way to freedom. And I think that's there's something there where we can try and frame these things to be like better for those communities. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that also I heard you say that I think is really important, and I'm 100% agree with, is ethnic studies cannot become a divisive, an us versus them, something that breeds hate, and that's a critique that comes up all the time, is not just from our former president, but from others, to say like ethnic studies is something that tells people that, you know, white people are bad, or it makes like an us versus them. Maybe that's because it's rooted in, or some of ethnic studies rooted in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire, you know, the idea of oppressor versus oppressed matrix, that like dynamic. What is your response to that idea? Because I've heard you say, and I know you believe that we can't teach ethnic studies in a way that's an us versus them kind of concept. But when you put that up against the narrative of oppressor versus oppressed, which has happened in human history forever, how do you reconcile those?
Well, first of all, people who say that have rarely taken actually an ethnic studies class. So they're talking about what they imagine goes on in the class without having been there for more than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And because I've taken ethnic studies classes, I've taught ethnic studies classes, I know a lot of ethnic studies teachers. And rather than teaching hate, there's a lot of emphasis on love, starting with self-love of yourself as a student and your fellow students, but not the emphasis on hate. Now, what people don't understand is who haven't taken ethnic studies, and especially white people, is when you start doing an analysis of systemic racism, because that's where the analysis is. It's not so much, these are some bad white people, but here's how racism works, and racism that has been constructed by white people and perpetuated by white people. And so there, you know, you can't, okay, then you were some of the bad ones, and then who are some of the good ones? It's like, let's take the people out and look at the systems and how the systems of racism got built and continue to operate in everyday life, even though the laws that supported them are long gone, but we still have institutional racism. And so how does that work? Which I guess does get into the critical race theory question of unpacking how race works. And ethnic studies spends a lot of time doing that, exploring how systems of oppression, racial oppression, got built in the first place, and how they are perpetuated. And it does get difficult for white people who are thinking about our own ancestors who helped construct the system, benefited from the system, didn't do anything to change the system. And where I try to go with people with that, of we are here now, and we have a lot of agency over what we do now. There have always been white people who worked against racism. And we now can decide if that's what we want to do, or if we want to continue to perpetuate racism. But it's not a given as to where you are, where your actions are going to be in this, this moment.
Yeah, I think systemic racism, that's another one that gets so controversial. And I've had to explain this many, many times. I dove into it a lot with a lot of people I really respect from all different sides of the aisle and stuff, and look for the overlap. And because it's like, you know, well, show me a racist law. It's like, that's checkers type thinking, think chess type thinking. So I give, you know, some examples, but I think when we try to attack systemic racism, I think what we have to do is attack like specific things. War on drugs would be an example. That's like a hill I'm always kind of fighting, is, you know, the war on drugs started by Nixon was clearly laid out as one way to lock up Black people. I mean, it's documented. So when you do that, when you lock up Black people for nonviolent, like marijuana possession, then you look at the statistics about, you know, single parent households, and you go, oh, why are Black guys not raising their kids? It's like, well, what percentage is thrown in jail for smoking a joint or having weed on them, or looking for economic opportunity when it doesn't exist because of white flight or whatever, and then you sell drugs? Like, this is complicated stuff. And the way we're able to be blind to it is because it's like, well, we fixed the laws, so now there's nothing to complain about. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. It's like, no, that's not the way this thing works. It's more complicated than that. I like the mindset of like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, the Booker T. Washington approach, but the W.E.B. Du Bois approach needs to go along with that. Do everything you can in your power to rise up, and you have a ton of hurdles in front of you, and you're like, oh man, this is so unfair. well, I'm gonna run these hurdles and build big legs while also fighting to get the hurdles removed. You know, like those aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
You know, and I don't know why. And I think that we just all want to go to our own side. That's like why point of the podcast and say like, oh, come on, just work harder. Or look how far we've come. Isn't it better to be a Black person in 2021 than it was in 1970? It's like, you know, I had Daryl Davis on my podcast twice, who I just love. And he said like, yes, it's both. It's look how far we've come and look how far we have to go. You look at the achievement gap. You look at a lot of things. We have a lot of work to do, and it's complicated work. It was easier in a way in the civil rights movement because it's like, this is a clear law right here we need to get changed. Now we need to dive in a little bit and find out what we can do to make things better. Would you agree with that?
Well, absolutely. Just an example from right now. Why is COVID ravaging communities of color? Mm-hmm. And it's generally not ravaging white communities. And then that gets you
white communities. Yeah. Huh? Elderly white communities, but yeah.
Well, elderly white communities, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, good point. But that gets you into things like who has what kind of jobs, who has access to what kind of healthcare, who has access to just homes that allow you to space yourself out from each other, who has access to what kind of transportation.
Yeah, there's so much. That's a great point. I mean, you know, Naval Ravikant, the like modern day philosopher, said we never had a lockdown. We just had the blue collars or the labor class deliver things to the white collars or something like that. It was like, oh, that's so true. You know, and there is an element about like vitamin D solubility with higher melanin in your skin and stuff like that. But the UK did a study on that. And even when you take away for like the biological, perhaps predisposition to have worse effects of COVID, it's still very present that poorer communities are going to be more negatively affected. And this group is disproportionately represented in poorer communities. Like that's the systemic racism.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the way I think that it's really important for us to view that. I've talked about the music industry. I've talked about college sports. If Black men are 7% of the population, how many NCAA Division I athletes are Black men? More than half. And then look at the way NCAA Division I athletes are treated. They're not paid. They're not paid for their likeness. They're not paid for endorsements. That's one of their only ways out. And, oh, well, they get a free education. I went to Penn State. I knew football players went to Penn State. They didn't get a great education. They were there to play ball. They had tutors sign their papers and write their papers for them. They're being used. They're being used to make millions of dollars off of video games and sell Nikes and sell tickets, and they're not being paid for it. And that's like one small example of the way that I think is a good way that I try to view systemic racism. When there's a group that's disproportionately affected by these policies, there could be something there that is because of discrimination, or the lack of changing it could be because of racism.
Yeah, and I try to tell people that the purpose of having these discussions isn't to sit around and lay blame, but rather it's to try to figure out what might be some solutions.
Solutions, yes. Yes, I'm with you. I'm with you 100% on that. Is we have to look at, okay, and we have to know the problem first. So we have to understand the problem, weigh out what are all of the possible unintended consequences of going about it, solving the problem this way. What's the worst that could happen? Because we could institute this policy. Think the road to hell is paved in good intentions. We have good intentions, but then something negative happens because we didn't foresee that. So let's talk about the problem. Let's weigh it out, and then we have to try it. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, and to go back to ethnic studies classes, this is actually what then gets taught in a lot of ethnic studies classes, is looking at community problems, using the academic tools to try to understand those problems, and then developing solutions, very often in collaboration with community members, and figuring out how to advocate politically for those solutions. And I think what upsets a lot of people, white people, maybe older white people, is seeing youth of color just not in the classroom, but out in the streets advocating for solutions to problems that they've been working on. And it's kind of jarring, I think, for a lot of people. And I know this is partly what happened in Tucson, to see the youth coming out and going to the city council, going to, saying, okay, we have blah, blah, blah problems in our community. We've analyzed it. Here's the data, blah, blah, blah. And we want you to do this and that by way of changing some city policies to fix these problems. Whoa, where'd they come from? And are they going to be trying to get our seats at some point in the near future?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, why is civics education not widely taught? I mean, it's not. We get in California, it's 1 semester of government, 1 semester to learn how to be active in your government, in your country. You know, voting, how that works, local government. There's no civics, and I really believe. I was talking to Eric Smith, who's a good friend of mine, a fellow educator I've had on the podcast, and I was like, do you see this as some sort of like systemic racism? And he's like, yeah. He's like, well, it's deeper than that, but yeah. And he's, you know, the idea that, you know, you don't want people rising up, really. You want to keep rich people rich and poor people poor. And that might be a tinfoil hat thing. But when you look at the way that there's not a lot of avenues to educate people on how to rise up in political power, why? Why don't we teach enough kids that kind of stuff? We really should. I think it's really important.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I think also people look at, like, you know, Dereck Bell, who's like, you know, one of the founding people of the founders of critical race theory. I think he invented the term. But, you know, he said things, I wrote down a quote, it's whites do all in their power to dominate and control. So you take a line like that out of context and he might believe it. But again, that's one person who's written a lot and he might think that way. But you take any Thomas Jefferson out of context. Well, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, slave owner, you know, had kids with one of his slaves, so clearly like raped people. Like, there's a lot here. Does that mean Thomas Jefferson is not valuable? I think he's extremely valuable. So if you're going to take people out of context and say like, well, that's why you should not listen to any of their ideas, that game can be played both ways. So don't play that game and just look at overall, what are their ideas? Try to steelman them, try and represent their ideas to the strongest way possible, and then see if there's benefit in that. I think that people do that way too often. One of the things that I want to bring up is you have shown the data about how success when you implement ethnic studies in a school or in a curriculum in a district, that overall test scores go up. Now, I know you're on board that test scores are just one, maybe not even a great measurement, but it's one measurement to show achievement. And and we can talk about test scores forever, but it does show something. So in that, I was always a data person. I love data. And when it comes to social science, I love data. And then I was exposed to the Boghossian hoax papers. Are you aware of that? The Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose hoax affair? It really messed me up. Essentially, they were college professors and academics that wrote fake academic papers, almost like the Sokol hoax. And they gave them into race studies, gender studies, fat studies, all of these different, and they got published, they got peer reviewed. They were complete BS. They made up like dog parks promote rape culture. They did one where they took, oh, this is so bad, Professor, like they took Mein Kampf and they changed everywhere it said Nazi, they said women of color. Everywhere it said Jews, they said straight white men. And they replaced that, submitted it. It got accepted, peer reviewed, and then published in an academic journal. And they got a bunch of them published. And they even won an award for excellent scholarship before they came out and revealed, like, we made all this up. This is all made up. And yet it passed through peer review. And that messed me up so bad because I was like, now I don't know what studies to believe or not. And I listened to Jonathan Haidt, and he said, the problem with peer review is we're humans and we're biased. And he gave an example that I think is pretty cool. He said, if a study comes out that shows that caffeine causes breast cancer, who will look very closely at that? Female coffee drinkers. They're going to go, wait a second, coffee causes breast cancer. I got to see, I got to poke holes in this. Okay. Where men who don't drink coffee might be like, sure, checks out. And I wonder, how do we know that the studies that are being covered are legitimate studies when it comes to ethnic studies or it comes to racial issues, gender issues, social justice in general, because social justice is such an important, it's a very empathetic cause. It's a very good, noble cause. I worry, because of their studies and what they revealed, I worry that people are gonna look the other way if it's bad scholarship because they want it to be true so bad. That's a concern of mine. You might not be familiar with what they did, but what are your thoughts? Can you ease my mind a little bit?
Okay. As it relates to the research on ethnic studies,
Yeah.
at least let me address some of that.
Yeah, because that's more like your area. Yeah.
Well, the larger issue is also an important issue. But with the research on ethnic studies, the main quantitative studies that I'm aware of, the one by Dee and Penner of the San Francisco Unified School District's Ethnic Studies Program, and the one by Cabrera et al. Of the Tucson Unified School District's Program. And then there was another experimental study that doesn't get mentioned very much, but by Kisker et al. That was looking at a math in a cultural context program in Alaska.
Uh-huh.
But the first two particularly, I believe them partly because I know the programs. I've been there. I know people who work with them. I know the researchers, and so to me, they're like trustworthy people, and data weren't being manufactured here. But I also, having taught ethnic studies types of classes, there's an element there that rings true with the experience that I see with my own students. I'm retired now, yeah. but the idea of curriculum speaking to students and engaging students, that I have spent years witnessing in my own classes, and at Cal State Monterey Bay, other people as well. The idea, which with the Tucson program, the developers of the Social Justice Education Project talked about, of developing an academic identity when the teachers you have believe in you and are willing to sit with you through working with very difficult stuff until you get it, and then you believe that you can take on more difficult material. I have also experienced that with my students, and so to me that's very believable, because that actually kind of speaks to my own approach to teaching and seeing the results of students who are able to do much more complex work than they thought they were capable of initially. And so I'll read these results, and partly because I know the context, where not all of the research that I reviewed, but some of the studies, and I know the researchers, and I know, and it rings true with what I've seen from my own experience, then I'm like, okay, yeah, this is believable. This wasn't manufactured.
Yeah, especially when you put it that way. Like, if you can just relate the material to them. I had a kid years and years ago, probably like 12, 15 years ago, early when I was teaching, and he was a mechanic. He'd always work on cars. He had El Caminos and stuff like that, always like apart in the parking lot, go out at lunch and tinker on them. And he hated math. And as soon as I related math to compression ratios and stuff like that, he got it. So I took all his math problems, stayed after school with him, and I just turned him into mechanics, and he got it. And I think that ethnic studies in a similar way, where we say, hey, let me relate this to something that you understand in your culture. That's kind of what you're aiming for, right?
Yeah, an example that I sometimes give when I'm giving talks about this. One of the classes that I taught at Cal State Monterey Bay was the pro-seminar to the master's program. And it was a little bit like an introduction to research. And so what I did in this class, which I taught a number of times, is I wanted the students to understand different epistemological perspectives on what counts as research, who does research, assumptions that it makes about the construction of knowledge, and so forth. And usually in education research classes, there will be two main paradigms that get looked at. And I think this has changed over time, but you back up about 20 years or so. Quantitative positivism, quantitative research, and phenomenology, which grounds itself mainly in qualitative research. I expanded that to also include narrative research or testimonial and emancipatory research. And as I would be teaching the class to this multiracial group of teachers, it was real interesting to watch how they understood and interpreted the four different research epistemological paradigms. When we would start with positivism and experimental research, and then it was usually, not always, but it tended to be more the white students that got it. And it tended to be the students of color who would look at that and say, I know how that's been used as a weapon against us. When you get to phenomenology, it was sort of more kind of neutral. When you got into narrative and storytelling, it was like all of a sudden for a lot of the Latino students, a light bulb went on, and the idea was dig into the knowledge that you have, because you as a person bring knowledge to the table, and you can tell your story, tell what you've experienced. And so then when I would ask the students to write knowledge from their own experience, many of the white students would be going, I don't have anything to say. And many of the Latino students would be writing pages. And then when I got into emancipatory research, which I was understanding as research that's done with the community, for the community purposes, not for the purposes of the individual researcher. And the researcher is like a collaborator and tool for the community that helps the community use the whole data collection process for solving community problems. And I remember one of the, another Latino student, but in my class, going, now I found my intellectual home. And many of the white students, not all of them, but many of the white students would be going, huh, emancipation? What are we talking about here? Huh. And it wasn't like there was a right or wrong answer, but looking at how, when I opened up what counts as research and which research paradigms we're going to spend time on, different ones really spoke to different students in the class, depending on their backgrounds and what they brought to the table.
That's great. Can I have you just expand a little bit, because people might be unclear, and I'm a little bit unclear as well. Like when you say have students be, I've heard you say students become knowledge creators. Mm-hmm. I was always, my definition of knowledge is something that you like, you discover. You learn about the world, what is, and that's like where wisdom and knowledge comes from. When you talk about like creating your students are knowledge creators, are you talking about like lived experiences, like their view of the world, like the way that they experience the world?
Well, even when I write an academic article, I'm creating knowledge. I'm not just discovering something that was already out there. And this is an epistemological assumption that I make, is that we, as we know and make sense out of the world and construct knowledge, rather than apprehending something that's already fully formed, that's out there independent of us, we're engaging with the world, but then putting it into a sense-making process. And it's that sense-making process where we're constructing knowledge. So when I do a study and write up an academic article, I don't think of myself as simply discovering something that was already there anyway. But through the sense-making process, I'm constructing knowledge.
Is that falsifiable? Like, can you, if you discover knowledge, can I prove that wrong? Or is it your experience, so your opinion, and that's,
I'll be collecting data, and like all researchers, you try to make as explicit as possible how the data were collected, so that somebody else can follow in your footsteps and try to use the same processes. And they may or may not come up with exactly the same conclusions. This is where research gets, kind of messy. Yeah. But researchers are supposed to make as explicit as possible how they came to the conclusions they came to, what the data sources they used were, how they gathered that and analyzed that data, so other people can follow and evaluate for themselves the veracity of the conclusions that they've come to.
And that's where it's so important that you are willing to, go through some sort of review process or engage with your ideas. Why I value you being on this podcast so much, because some people don't want their ideas to be challenged. And I use Ibram Kendi as a good example. He's like one of the premier critical race theorists out there, and he's, kind of a celebrity now. But Coleman Hughes and Chloe Valdery are both, intellectual Black individuals who have issues with him, and they've asked him. Coleman Hughes even said, hey, can we have a public, respectful debate or a conversation debate? We'll raise money and I'll give all the proceeds to the United Negro College Fund just because I want to pick your brain about stuff. And Ibram Kendi didn't want to. And I understand why he might not want to, but I think that when you say like, okay, this is the knowledge I've created, here's my research. And then someone goes, well, here are some flaws in your research. And then you just go, no, I'm not gonna address those things. Then what we do is now we're in this echo chamber where they say your research is BS, you say it's not, and then your side will just say your research is BS. No, it's not. You're just trying to take him down. No, I'm not. And then we don't blend. And that's so important because you don't want to have bad ideas. As a researcher, as a professor, as a thinker, you don't want to have bad ideas. You kind of want people poking holes in your ideas to get them stronger. That's what peer review is supposed to be. And I worry how much of that's going on. I hope it's a lot. I hope that I'm wrong, that it's not being scrutinized enough because of the way it's labeled, because racism, sexism, transphobia, all these things are very pressing. They're very emotionally tied issues that I worry that there isn't enough of a willingness to, critique it. But I might be wrong. I might be wrong on that.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with you. But with issues related to race and related to ethnic studies, when people are going to critique and want to have a dialogue, I really appreciate when they come to the table having spent some time doing their homework. So we're not back at the question of, does race exist? Does racism exist? Because I spent like years with, teaching that. And it's like, I'm not going to start a dialogue with you if that's where you are. Yeah. Just do your homework first. Or somebody who's going to, ethnic studies is divisive. I know this because blah, 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 but the person has never been near an ethnic studies class and doesn't read work in ethnic studies. It's like, I've got other things to do. But if you're somebody who works in the field and who works with the issues, then I'm glad to have a dialogue with you, and then we can disagree because at least we're coming to the table with.
I'm with you 100%. I agree. I couldn't agree more. That's why someone like James Lindsay, he's read all of it. He knows it frontwards and backwards, and that's why I think he's important to interact with. A lot of people don't want to, but he knows this stuff really. He's read everything. Coleman Hughes is another one. Chloe Valdery is another one. I have one more question for you though. I just wanted I dove into the Takaki book, the ethnic studies book.
Which one?
Huh?
Which
it was the ethnic studies textbook. That's like one of the main textbooks for the model curriculum in California.
Probably a different mirror.
Shoot, I don't have it in front of me. I forget. I had a digital copy and I was going through it, but they said something about native cultures and about how they were just horribly treated and all that, the history of like Native Americans. But then this summer I read a book called Empire of the Summer Moon about the Comanche. And I was like, oh my gosh, like the Comanche were so brutal, just like raping and skinning people alive and killing children and blah, 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 blah. And I go, I wonder if that should be included in ethnic studies. Like, should we include the good and the bad? Like Native American cultures were treated terribly. We took land, blah, blah, blah. And they were horrible too. Like that gushy, that weird, uncomfortable nuance of cultures, that there is positives and there is negatives. And together you get what truth is. What are your thoughts on bringing up those kinds of realities, the negatives within cultures, in addition to the positive? Do you think that it's a disservice, or do you think that it's a positive?
I think it depends on who your audience is and what your purpose is.
Why? Yeah.
Yeah. If you're teaching people about the colonization of indigenous peoples who are having a hard time wrapping their minds around that concept. I don't want to spend time giving them reasons to think that the colonization was probably a good idea.
Yeah.
But after people have understood and really sat with the devastating impact of colonization. And then if we want to look at, and the Comanche may have been brutal, everybody wasn't brutal. So you need to be real tribal specific and time specific. And
yeah, they're super diverse, yeah.
Yeah, then getting into those specifics can happen productively. But I think it really depends on who your audience is, what the context is, and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I love the nuance. Like that doesn't, I'm an American history teacher and I love this country. I don't know, I can show you, I'm wearing shorts. I'm wearing red, white, and blue socks. And I love this country. I normally have an American flag when I teach my classes, but I am brutally critical in my US history class about the things that we've done. And I think about it like your good friend. Like your best friend is the one that tells you like you look like crap today. You're acting like an a-hole. Like that's your best friend. Like the one who calls you out so that you can get better. But I like what you said where it's like we have to focus, you have to get settled an important agenda, and then we can highlight some of the nuance around this. Like nothing is a monolith. People aren't monoliths, cultures aren't monoliths. They're all very, very diverse, and it's complicated. And letting kids kind of understand that complicated nature, I think is really a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sleeter, we've done an hour. I am so stoked to have you here.
Wow, that hour flew.
I know. Where can people find you, see your work, anything like that? I know you're retired, but like, what are you up to if people, want to, I don't know, consulting, whatever.
The easiest thing is to go to my website,
yeah,
which is christinesleeter.org. And I keep it up to date in terms of things that my blog post's not really very up to date, but in terms of my writing and my speaking and stuff. And if you send me the link to this, then I will also put that on there under the drop-down box of in the media. I'm retired, but I'm also writing novels. I don't know how aware you were of that, but novels that grapple with the issues that we've been talking about.
Oh,
so
cool.
I'm working on my fourth novel right now. The third novel, which will be coming out in May, I think, grapples with issues around African Americans and whites and our interconnectedness historically as well as currently.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I love that. That's very, very cool. I would love to maybe in the future, I think that we never really dove into like the politicization of it, like how it's a lot more like left leaning. And I wonder how we can like adapt like the kind of more conservative or center right, like kind of arguments for equality and stuff like that as well, maybe for another time. Cause I think that there is like a political ideological blind spot that I think is important to reconcile. I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that, where we can just cover another time.
I think that's probably a good topic for a whole nother radio show.
Right, it's deep, right? So
I will say I do, even though I can certainly be labeled as to where I am politically. I try to, when I'm talking with people, talk about issues and talk about experiences and stuff, rather than try to put labels on things, because sometimes labels can end up being divisive. Absolutely.
I don't know if you're familiar with Irshad Manji. I've worked with her before. I will send you her work. She wrote a book called Don't Label Me. She's a African refugee. She's Muslim. She's gay. She's all these things. And she wrote a book called Don't Label Me. She's like, all this stuff, but you don't know anything about me based on those markers. Yeah. It's pretty great. I'll send you her stuff. It's fantastic. But Dr. Sleeter, thank you so much for doing this. This was great. I hope that it brought people who were kind of galvanized in their side a little bit more to the center, so we can have these conversations, because that's what this thing's all about.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, and do send me the link so that I can put it on my website.
I absolutely will. All right. Take care.